The wind cut through the valley like a pack of knives, the kind that didn't simply sting the skin, but reached straight into the bone. Morgan Hale stepped out of his gate, bracing against the storm, lifting his lantern higher as snow came down in thick, blinding sheets. That was when he saw her, first a dark shape, then the silhouette of a woman forcing her way through the storm as if the cold no longer had the strength to stop her. She was enormous, tall and broad-shouldered, her frame built like someone forged by hardship. Her coat was torn in several places, exposing purple-black bruises beneath. Strands of wet black hair clung to her cheeks, her bare feet half buried in powdery snow. She didn't tremble, didn't waver, but the exhaustion in her stance made it clear she had been walking far longer than any soul should in such killing weather. When Morgan raised the lantern fully, her eyes lifted to meet his, dark, pained, and filled with a desperate resolve that needed no explanation. And then, in a voice rough as gravel scraped across wood, she spoke. "I need a place for one night. I will do anything you ask." Morgan didn't stare at her because of the offer. He stared because he recognized the look in her eyes, the look of someone who had reached the end of every road and found no door left open. He stepped aside without hesitation, pushing the gate wide so the wind stopped battering her directly. "One more hour out here and you'd be dead," he said simply. "Come inside." She walked past him heavily, like each footstep weighed more than the storm itself. The moment the cabin door shut behind them, the harsh roar outside collapsed into a dull howl. Inside, the glow from the hearth spread warmth through the cramped wooden room. The firelight washed over her bruises, revealing the old scars beneath the new ones, twisted lines that told stories she had yet to speak. Morgan placed the lantern on the table. "Sit near the fire. You're freezing." She hesitated as though unsure whether she belonged anywhere near comfort, but eventually lowered herself to the floor, stretching out her large hands toward the flames. Her breathing was uneven, each inhale stiff with pain, each exhale sounding like the weight of miles traveled. Morgan ladled hot soup into a bowl and offered it gently. She stared at the bowl for a moment as though deciding whether it was real, then accepted it. "Aren't you afraid of me?" she asked quietly. Her voice held no threat, only the tired curiosity of someone who had grown used to suspicion. Morgan shrugged. "Men usually are, but I'm not seeing a monster. I'm seeing someone who's about to collapse from cold." She lowered her gaze and ate slowly, each spoonful steady but weak, as if she were rationing strength she no longer possessed. When she finished, Morgan handed her a thick blanket. She wrapped it tightly around her legs, then spoke after a long silence. "I will leave at sunrise. I don't want to bring trouble into your home." Morgan glanced at the frost-covered window, where snow piled in growing drifts. There's nowhere to go. Snow's knee-deep already. Walking out there now is choosing death. She seemed ready to argue, but the storm answered for him, rattling the cabin door like an angry spirit. Eventually, she lowered her head. "If I stay, what do you want in return?" Morgan leaned against the wall, folding his arms. "Nothing, just survive the storm." She studied him long and hard, searching him for the kind of intentions she'd clearly learned to fear. But he didn't look away. At last, she lay down on the floor near the fire, curling beneath the blankets like a wounded creature instinctively drawn to warmth but unfamiliar with safety. Morgan sat at the table, carving a piece of wood, glancing over every so often at the woman sleeping beside the flames. Her breaths were heavy, almost dragging, but slowly the tension in her shoulders softened, replaced by the fragile surrender of someone who hadn't rested in far too long. Outside, the storm screamed against the cabin walls, but inside the small room was a strange pocket of stillness. Not peaceful, just quiet, in the way two strangers sharing shelter often are. Morgan didn't know her name yet, nor her story, nor the reason she bore scars like tally marks of battles no one should endure. But he sensed this night would change something, maybe her life, maybe his, maybe both. And when dawn came pale and icy, the snow stacked even higher than the night before, sealing the mountain like a prison of white. When she rose and stepped beside him, her voice low but clearer than last night, she said, "It seems I am not leaving yet." Morgan offered her a cup of hot water. "No," he replied gently. Not today. Asha, he finally learned her name that morning, followed Morgan outside as he inspected the yard. Snow was stacked in towering drifts, the storm's fury etched across every fence post and rooftop like white scars. The wind snapped at their coats, but she didn't flinch. Instead, she bent down, wrapped her hands around a fallen tree trunk, and lifted it as easily as Morgan would a piece of firewood. He paused mid-step, eyebrows raised. "You always been that strong?" he asked. Asha shrugged as if the answer were obvious. "In my tribe, strength is survival." The two spent the day working side by side, repairing the stable roof, clearing a narrow path around the cabin, chopping enough wood to last another week. Asha moved like someone who'd spent her life doing work twice her share, her muscles shifting beneath her worn shirt with each swing of the axe. Morgan couldn't deny it. Her presence made the place feel alive, less like a lonely outpost and more like a shared space. That evening, they ate by the fire, the crackling logs filling the silence with a gentle rhythm. Asha hugged her knees near the hearth, her eyes half hidden in the flickering glow. Then, without warning, she asked, "It has been months since I last shared a night with anyone. What about you?" Morgan's hand froze halfway to lifting his spoon. He set the bowl down carefully and leaned back. "I don't expect anything like that from you," he said evenly. "You're not here because you owe me something." Asha didn't look away, but the shadows softened around her features. "The last man I trusted didn't think like you." Morgan met her gaze. "Then he wasn't worth trusting." She didn't speak again, but the tension in her fingers, the way they had been gripping the blanket, eased, as if she'd unclenched a part of herself she hadn't known was tight. That night, Morgan slept on his bed while Asha stayed near the fire. There was still distance between them, but a very different kind of distance, no longer shaped by suspicion but by cautious peace. Before sleep claimed her, she whispered into the darkness, "Tomorrow I will help with whatever you need. I don't take shelter without giving something back." Morgan, drifting towards sleep, replied softly, "Asha, you owe me nothing." The blizzard refused to relent. Days passed with the sky locked in grey and the valley buried under more snow than Morgan had seen in years. One evening, as the fire burned bright, Morgan noticed a change in Asha. She wasn't watching the flames like usual. Instead, she stared at a dark corner of the room, her jaw set tight. The shadows seemed to stir old memories. Morgan added a log to the fire and sat down beside her, keeping just enough space so she wouldn't feel trapped. "Those wounds on your shoulders," he said quietly. "They weren't from the mountain, were they?" Asha's eyes stayed fixed on the shadows. Her voice came slow and flat, like she was pulling each word up from a buried place. "No. People did this." Morgan waited, not pushing, not demanding. After a long silence, she lifted the blanket from her shoulders. The scars were brutal, twisted lines, bruises faded to grey, signs of blows delivered by hands that didn't care if she lived or died. "My tribe," she said, "they wanted to force me to belong to a man I despised, a man with more power than mercy." Her voice held no tremor, but the steadiness itself was painful, like someone who had survived so much that numbness had become armor. "I refused," she continued. "They called me a traitor. They beat me until I couldn't stand." Morgan's fists tightened, but he kept his tone gentle. "Then they cast you out." Asha nodded. "Dragged me to the valley's edge and left me to die. I walked for days, maybe weeks. I lost track." She finally turned her gaze toward him, and for the first time since she'd arrived, the sharpness in her eyes dimmed, revealing exhaustion that no fire could warm. "I needed to know if you were like them," she admitted. "Even the things I asked you, I was testing you." Morgan nodded once. "Then hear it again. The answer is no. I am not them." Asha inhaled deeply, the breath shaking slightly as another wall inside her cracked and fell. "It's been a long time since I felt safe." The fire popped, scattering sparks like tiny stars. Morgan didn't reach for her or crowd her. He simply stayed beside her, steady and silent. A presence, not a demand. For the first time since stepping into his cabin, Asha Redmoon allowed herself to let the past loosen its grip, if only a little. Oh, the days that followed unfolded with a quiet rhythm neither of them had expected. The blizzard still roared outside, burying the world in white. But inside the cabin, life took on a gentle steadiness. Asha woke each morning to find the fire already fed, the pot warmed, and a cup of hot water waiting on the table. Morgan, in turn, grew familiar with the sure, confident sound of her footsteps outside, steps that told him she was hauling wood, checking the stable, or clearing paths with strength most men couldn't match. The cabin no longer felt like a hollow shelter built for one. Her presence filled the space without crowding it. One afternoon, Asha stood in the doorway, arms folded as she stared out into the valley. The sky had softened to a pale blue, the storm finally losing strength. Morgan joined her, handing her a mug of steaming coffee. "The sky's calm today," he said. She took the cup, letting the warmth seep into her palms. For a long moment she said nothing. Then, almost as if it slipped out unintentionally, she whispered, "When spring comes, what happens then?" Morgan didn't answer immediately. He knew her words weren't about the weather. They were about them, this strange partnership formed under snow and firelight, about where she belonged once the world thawed. Asha's face remained unreadable, but there was a flicker in her eyes he hadn't seen before, uncertainty, fear of losing something she hadn't realized she wanted. He sat down on the porch step and patted the space beside him. After a moment, she sat too, their shoulders close enough for warmth to pass between them. "What do you want to happen?" Morgan finally asked. That question made Asha still, her breath visible in the cold air. She didn't move, didn't speak, but her grip around the mug tightened as if bracing herself. Her whole life had been shaped by decisions made for her. Forced paths, forced loyalties, forced pain. Choosing something for herself was foreign terrain. Morgan's voice was low and steady. "You don't have to leave unless you want to." The silence stretched long, heavy with things neither dared to say. Then Asha leaned just slightly against him, not enough to claim him, but enough to answer. "I never thought there was a place I could choose." Morgan's chest tightened. "Now you do." When the wind finally eased and the mountains softened beneath the gentler light of late winter, Morgan prepared for a trip into town. He shut the stable door and slung his saddlebag over his shoulder. Asha watched him with careful eyes, hiding something like worry behind her calm expression. "How long?" she asked. "Half a day," he said. "I'll be back before nightfall." She nodded, but Morgan could sense her unease. She had been abandoned enough times in life to know what silence could mean. He placed a hand on her shoulder, a reassuring anchor. "Asha, I'm coming back. Don't worry." She held his gaze for a long moment, then nodded. Morgan rode down the snowy trail until the trees swallowed him. Asha remained in the doorway long after his figure disappeared from sight, her broad silhouette framed by melting icicles and the soft hiss of thawing snow. Morgan's trip into town was short, but significant. He avoided the crowded shops and headed straight to the attorney's office. There, with steady handwriting, he wrote words that carried weight far beyond ink. Asha Redmoon, permanent resident under protection of Morgan Hale. When the seal was pressed into the document, a quiet certainty settled in his chest. This was not ownership. It was recognition. A place in society for someone who had been denied every place she once called home. By the time Morgan returned, dusk had settled over the hills, painting the snow in tones of lavender and gold. Asha opened the door before he even reached it. Her eyes, usually sharp and steady, held an unmistakable relief. "You came back," she said. Morgan smiled faintly. "I told you I would." He handed her the sealed paper. Asha took it carefully, as though afraid it might vanish. She read every word, her lips parting just slightly as she understood its meaning. Then she looked up at him, confusion and gratitude tangled together. "Why would you do this?" Morgan shrugged gently. "Because you deserve a place to belong." Asha didn't speak. The silence that followed was not empty. It was filled with the weight of a truth she had never received from anyone before. She set the paper on the table and stepped forward, her presence filling the space between them with warmth and quiet intensity. That night, when she walked into Morgan's room, there was no hesitation, no shame, no fear. She stood beside his bed, her voice low and steady. "I am staying." Morgan met her eyes, seeing not the broken wanderer she'd been, but the woman she had become in his presence, strong, unyielding, and finally choosing something for herself. Asha lay beside him, their hands finding each other in the quiet. Outside, winter melted slowly, but inside the cabin something new had already begun to grow. Spring didn't burst onto the mountain in a blaze of color. It crept in gently, like a shy visitor. Snow thinned into trickling streams that wove through the rocks, carrying the scent of cold pine and new life. Asha stood in the doorway one morning, her hair loose around her shoulders, watching the valley change shade by shade. She still carried the strength that defined her, but the wild, cornered look she once wore had softened, replaced by something steadier. Peace, perhaps, or the early shape of belonging. Morgan stepped out behind her with 2 cups of hot water, the steam curling between them like a small bridge. "Looks better than winter," he murmured. Asha accepted her cup with a quiet hum. "I've never seen snow melt," she said. "Not like this. Not with someone beside me." Morgan's heart tightened in a way he didn't quite expect. "Come with me," he said. She didn't ask why, only followed as he led her through the pine woods, where patches of brown earth peeked through. They reached the clearing under the largest pine, the place where they had built fires in the early days of her arrival. Asha looked around. "Why here?" Morgan stood before her, the breeze tugging gently at his coat. "Because this is where everything changed," he said quietly. "This is where you first let yourself be close to me, where I realized the cabin didn't feel empty anymore." Asha blinked, her expression unreadable. Morgan took a slow breath, stepping closer, not enough to crowd her, but enough to let her know he was choosing honesty over fear. "Asha, you staying here made this place a home." She looked down, confused by the tenderness in his voice. "I don't understand what you're saying." Morgan rubbed the back of his neck, the words heavy but certain. "I want to marry you." The forest seemed to fall silent at his confession. Asha stared at him, her dark eyes wide, vulnerable in a way he had never seen. "Why?" she asked, her voice barely more than breath. "Because I choose you," he answered. "Not out of pity, not out of obligation, but because I want a life with you." Asha looked at her hands, hands that once bled, hands that carried the weight of her tribe's cruelty, hands that had fought to keep her freedom. And now those same hands trembled as she reached out, touching Morgan's chest, feeling the steady beat of a promise. "We will be a family," she said softly, sealing her answer with that simple truth. Morgan exhaled, a slow release of tension he didn't know he'd held. Foreheads touching, breath mingling, they stood beneath the towering pine as if the earth itself acknowledged their vow. No grand ceremony followed, just a quiet wedding that afternoon under the open sky. The breeze moved through the branches like a blessing. With the soft light filtering through, Asha Red Moon was no longer a woman cast out of her tribe. She became Asha Hale. Summer came earlier than usual that year. The snow melted completely, revealing fields of wildflowers stretching across the slopes in gold and lavender waves. The cabin, once cold and echoing with loneliness, now thrummed with life. Asha spent the warm mornings hanging blankets to dry, sunlight tracing soft lines across her shoulders. Her movements were still powerful, but something gentler lived within them now, a lightness she'd never known. Morgan watched her from the stable doorway, dust on his hands, love in his eyes. When he called her name, she turned with a faint smile. Then she placed her palm on her belly, letting the gesture speak for itself. Morgan froze, the world narrowing to that single moment. Asha stepped closer, took his hand, and placed it over her stomach. Still flat, but carrying a warmth that felt like a dawning future. "In a few months," she whispered, "this home will have one more heartbeat." Morgan pulled her into his arms, his hand still resting over the new life they had created. The forest, the wind, the lingering scent of pine, all faded until only their shared breath existed. "Asha." "Thank you," he murmured. She rested her forehead against his. "Do not thank me. We made this together." The weeks that followed were filled with preparation. Morgan added windows to the cabin, fixed the leaky roof, and built a wooden cradle by hand, smoothing every edge with care. Asha ran her fingers across the cradle's surface and laughed softly. "This child will be strong," she teased, "born from two people who do not break easily." Morgan pulled her close, warmth blooming between them. As the sun set that evening, they stood on the porch, his hand on her shoulder, her head resting lightly against him. The valley glowed in amber light, a quiet promise of tomorrow. Inside that once lonely cabin now lived a man who had opened his door to a stranger, a woman who had survived the worst a heart can endure, and the small growing life they had created together. A real family, built not from blood or tribe or obligation, but from choice, from trust, from two souls who realize that strength is not only found in surviving pain, but in allowing someone close enough to help carry it. My friend, remember this. Sometimes the bravest act isn't fighting a battle, it's letting someone in. Pain makes us build walls, but love teaches us to open them slowly, carefully until the light returns. I hope you, wherever you are, find someone who brings warmth into your winters and peace into your storms. If this story touched your heart, drop your thoughts in the comments below. Hit like if you enjoyed it, and don't forget to subscribe for more powerful Western tales coming your way.